All right, folks, it's Peter Cole, and I'm back with part 7 of my Intro to Orchestral Sample Libraries series. This is a series I'm doing for beginners. If you're first starting out trying to get your orchestral sample libraries to sound more realistic, this is the series for you. In this video, we got a big topic. It's reverb. And when I started thinking about this, I realized we could talk for hours and hours and hours on reverb. It's super important. So I want to try to keep this video a little shorter than some of my other videos. So I'm going to just focus on kind of the basics of reverb, what it is, how it applies to the world of orchestral sample libraries, and just kind of touch on the surface of a lot of the features you might see within your reverb plugins. And we'll kind of put things together. And then in a future video, I'm going to be talking more about the spatial concepts of reverb and how to really place instruments in a space, and that's where it gets really exciting and a bit more complicated, frankly, as well as the mixing, how we use reverb in our mixes, and that's where things really start to come together. But first, let's just kind of take baby steps and just learn what reverb is. To that point, while I am focused on the world of orchestral and orchestral sample libraries, it doesn't mean that this won't apply to you if you are, making pop music or electronic or country music. These concepts, particularly in this video, since it's a more intro one, likely these reverb concepts are going to apply to any kind of music. So the crazy thing about reverb for me is when I first started recording, I always lumped it. I just thought reverb was like this effect, which of course it is, but I just kind of lumped it in with delay and my flangers and my distortion and my chorus effects back in the day. I just kind of thought of it as an effect that made things, sound bigger and maybe created some space, which it does. But particularly as I started learning more about the world of orchestras and how to make an orchestra sound more realistic, I realized I was missing back then a major fundamental aspect of reverb, in that it's there. We have reverb as a tool. It's there to actually create a space for our music to be performed inside of, which sounds kind of obvious, and it might be obvious to you already, but to me, it was a big shift in my thinking when I really realized, wait a minute, actually, yes, reverb sounds cool and it's an effect, and I can use it to make my snare drum sound really big, and it's great on vocals because it makes it sound like they're singing in a concert hall. Yes, let's take it a step further, and in the context of an orchestra, or even a band for that matter, right? A band is playing together in a room, and that room has a sound, and that room sound impacts the sound of our recording. And nowhere is that more important than the orchestral world. And to that point, I want to pause for a second and encourage you to watch the first video in this series, because that's where I'm really talking about room sound and how samples are recorded either wet or dry. So if they're recorded wet, they're including that room sound in the sample. If they're recorded dry, they are not including that room sound. And that's a really important concept to be clear on first before you dive into, your reverb plugins and you start turning dials. You want to really understand, well, wait a minute, what samples, what sounds am I working with here? Do they have reverb already in them, the room sound baked into the sample, or are they completely dry? Then, once you get that down, I would encourage you, again, before you open up your plugins and start playing around, when you first sit down to think about reverb or how you're going to apply it in your production, think about, well, where is this being performed? Am I a punk band in my garage? Am I a punk band in a giant coliseum? Am I an orchestra in a bathroom, which would be physically impossible, right? So an orchestra probably is in a giant hall, right? So think about the space that you are trying to have your listener listen inside of. So that's what it's about. That's what ultimately we're trying to do here. We want to create an environment and place our music inside that environment and allow our listener to believe that it's being recorded there. So in the context of a sample library that has included that room sound, they've done a lot of the work for us already because they have recorded. Let's use Spitfire as an example. I use Spitfire libraries religiously, and they record a lot of their libraries, most of their libraries, in Air Studios in London, and they include the sound of that room, Air Studios, in the sample. So when I'm playing a Spitfire library, I'm not just playing the sound of a cello or a violin or the whole symphony. I'm playing the sound of Air Studios as well. So I'm getting the experience of the instrument played inside the room. Completely opposite of that would be a library like LA Scoring Strings, which does not include the sound of the room. It's as dry as possible. So in that scenario, I need to use reverb to place that dry sample into a room. So once we've established the type of room we want to place our music inside of, and for the purposes of this discussion, I am talking about orchestral music, and orchestras are large. There's lots of people, right? Dozens and dozens of players. Again, that's a lot different from a punk band in a garage. An orchestra requires a big space in order to fit all those players into it. Another big distinction, right? So an orchestra, our ears throughout history have just become accustomed to hearing an orchestra played inside of a big room because that's the only place they'll fit. Again, you can't put them in a bathroom. They need to be put in a big space. So if that's the character we're after, we're going to try to recreate the sound of a big hall or a big church, somewhere where an entire orchestra could fit. So we're going to be focused when we're playing with our reverbs and trying to recreate that sound. That's where we're coming from. And I think that's really important. I think that's a great starting point before you dive in. Again, before you dive into all the plugins and moving dials around, stop for a second and be clear on what you're trying to achieve. Okay, so now before we jump into the computer, just really quick, again, what is reverb exactly? And this is a huge scientific discussion that I'm not going to get into. But for the purposes of what we're learning here today, of course, reverb is the sound we hear when an instrument, or any sound, frankly, is played in a space, and there's the initial striking of that instrument, whether it's a drum or a string on your guitar or a string on your cello. That sound first starts at the source, the instrument, and it's going to, depending on the size of the room, it's going to then bounce. That sound is going to bounce off the surfaces of the room. And those bounces are called reflections. And when they pile up and you get a lot of those reflections, that's what ultimately creates that reverb sound, that kind of wash of echo. But I want to be careful how we use the word echo, because echo is really like the extreme example of that, right? Echo is like when we go, hello, 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 hello. That's what we think about when we think of echo. What reverb is kind of like a condensed version of that, right? You don't hear those normally anyway. You don't hear all those individual echoes, those separate little reflections. They're kind of compressed into this kind of wash of sound that we hear as reverb, and that helps us figure out the size of the room and how the room, like the materials of the room. As an example, I think a great way to think about this is, next time you're in your bathroom, look around, and a bathroom is a small space usually, right? Unless you're living in some giant mansion somewhere with a huge bathroom. Most of us have smaller bathrooms that don't fit orchestras. And perhaps more importantly, the surfaces of the walls and the floor and the ceiling are very reflective, right? It's tile, it's glass, the mirrors, the shower. These are all very hard surfaces, and they reflect the sound. So it's a small space and very reflective. That's like a recipe for a lot of little reflections bouncing back very quickly, letting your ears know that you're in a small space because you're hearing the reflections coming back very quickly because, again, the surfaces are not absorbing the sound, they're bouncing it back, and because it's a small space, you're hearing that very quickly. Now let's step into a giant hall, a symphony hall, and perhaps you're sitting in the middle of the stage and you clap your hands. Imagine that sound. First of all, the space is enormous, much bigger than a bathroom. So by the time you clap your hands and that sound hits the closest surface, it's going to be a lot further than your bathroom. Then potentially the symphony has better, or I guess I should say more absorbing surfaces. So some of that will get absorbed by the room actually, because again, a bathroom is glass and tile and very hard surfaces that don't absorb the sound. So it just pushes it right back. But in a symphony hall, especially one that's actually been acoustically treated, well, they're going to absorb some of those sounds, particularly certain frequencies. And of course, that gets into acoustics and how the room is tuned, but it's not going to have the same sound, drastically different. I think you can imagine that. So again, let's imagine what we're trying to recreate here. Are we trying to recreate the sound of a small room or a big room? Well, we're talking about orchestras here in this video, so we're going to try to create a big room. And that leads me directly to jumping into the plugins and talking about the different types of reverb, as well as all those different tools and things you can use to tweak the reverbs to create those room sizes and those room sounds. So let's jump into the DAW. I'm inside of Logic, but of course this applies to any DAW you own, at least the ones that I know of, right? You're going to have the ability to add digital reverbs. And in general, there are two basic types of reverb. There are what's called a convolution reverb, which I have open here. This is Quantum Leap Spaces. This is the original version. I have the newer version as well, so you might be more used to that one. But I'm actually purposely calling this one up because I want to, because in the older version, they list out a lot more detail of how the reverb was created, which I find very interesting, and I wanted to share that with you so you can understand it better. So with the convolution reverb, and you can actually see, this is what I'm talking about, they record the sound of the reverb. So they go into this hall, they go into a symphony hall, they have microphones in the room, so you can actually see the microphone they used, right? This Telefunken, and the preamp they used. I mean, this is what I mean. This is why I find this cool. And they they generate some sort of sound that I don't understand how they do that, but they generate this sound that is shot out in the room, and then they record that sound. They record the reverb that comes from that. Crazy, right? So they're actually recording that reverb, and then they bring that in, and through software and stuff we're not going to get into, they're able to analyze the that reverb sound. So it's the actual sound of the room. That's the key. Convolution reverbs are actually recording the sound of the room, and they're allowing you to buy the software and bring that room into your DAW. Freaking cool, right? So in this case, another reason why I like using spaces as an example is we can see, you can't really read the full name here, but this stands for Southern California Hall Strings, because it was specific to a string reverb. And really quickly, let me just show you the presets in here in case you're not familiar with it. Here we are. So I've selected an instrument specific. You can also just go and pick your churches, your concert halls, rooms. Wonder if they have a bathroom in here. Do they have a bathroom in here? No, but they have different rooms. But of course, I want to stay focused on the context of strings for orchestras. So I picked the string section. So you can see when you open up the strings, you get all these choices of different places to place your strings. How cool is that? Like, this is one of my favorite ones, actually, the San Francisco Hall. So I can place my strings inside of this San Francisco hall that they used to record it. So they went to some hall in San Francisco And they use this Telefunken mic and this Neve 1073 preamp, and they recorded the sound of this San Francisco hall, and then they digitized it. They created like a blueprint of the reverb and placed it inside of the software, Spaces. Really freaking cool. So now that I have that loaded in my DAW, I can bring up one of my sample libraries, and we can hear what it would sound like played in the San Francisco hall. So I'm going to bring this up, and this brings us to another important concept, which I touched on at the beginning, which is, again, the difference between a wet and dry sample. So I have Albion 1 Spitfire, which of course was recorded in Air Studios, very wet. So I'm going to solo that just so you can hear it. And by the way, I'm going to turn the reverb off, the Spaces reverb off, just because I want you to hear just the sound of Air Studios. Wow. So again, there's no Spaces reverb, see? It's not making any noise. I'm not engaging that at all. This is purely Albion 1. So this is what I was saying before. If you have a wet reverb to begin, or sorry, if you have a wet sample to begin with, you're going to need likely less digital reverb because you already have the room. It's already in there. Where it gets a little funky is if you're mixing and blending different sample libraries from different, that were recorded in different rooms. Well, now you got different parts of the orchestra in different rooms. So it's a whole nother video on that. But you got to be careful on how you blend them. And this is where the digital reverbs that we're talking about can help, because they can kind of help glue all that together, because you're ultimately placing it within one kind of digital reverb. But anyway, you can hear this already has a lot of reverb, but because Albion provides the ability to adjust our mic positions, I can crank this all the way to the beginning. And now watch here, this is another great learning tool, because we're actually moving the audience closer to the orchestra. So now there's less room sound because we're moving it closer. We're essentially moving the microphones closer to the instruments. So now listen. Quite a bit less. Interestingly though, you can probably still hear just a little bit of room. And that's my one gripe with the Spitfire libraries, at least the ones I have, is no matter how close you get, like I would expect this to be pretty darn dry at this point, but I still hear a bit of the room in there. And of course, if we go to the extreme end and move it way back, listen to that. So that's reverb at its ultimate, right? But of course, there's not a lot of control here. So what we're doing is we're moving, again, the positions of the microphones. The closer you get to the instrument, well, then you hear more instrument and less room. Further away from the instrument, you hear less instrument and more room. So it depends on the sound you're after and how big of a room you want to create. Here, you might think that's a pretty small room. Might even just be a little chamber orchestra at that point, right? The more I pull this back, I mean, it's kind of obvious, right? Now the room gets bigger, it sounds more epic, and it's all just by using essentially the sound of the room, increasing it or decreasing it. So that's really what reverb is for. So when we have our digital reverbs, we are potentially compensating for anything that's missing in our sample library, like there's not enough room sound, which is not the case with Albion 1, clearly, because it's got plenty of room sound. Or we're using it to kind of glue the sound together. So let's go to the other extreme. I'm going to mute Albion 1, and now we're just going to hear LA scoring strings, which I mentioned a minute ago is an example of an extremely dry library. So listen to this. So when I talk about dry, when I talk about no room sound, this is what I mean. Kind of wish that the Spitfire stuff would give this kind of control. Maybe some other libraries do, and I just don't know. But I've never found a library as dry and just pure instrument as LA scoring strings. It's as if they've moved the mic right up next to the string, and they don't allow you to hear anything else, just that string, which I love. I mean, this is great control, because if you're in a pinch and you really want to punch your instruments through, well, the first thing you do is reduce the room sound. You move the sound closer to the listener, right? Just like the diagram, the Spitfire diagram shows here. We're moving the listener closer to the sound source, and that makes it sound more upfront, more intimate. It cuts through the mix. So, but of course you lose the room sound. Anyway, let's listen to LA scoring strings. I would like to place it inside of a room now. So when we go to insert our reverbs into our mix, and I'm going to go into this way more in the next video when we talk about mixing and production and how to use reverb in that context. That's a big topic. But just really briefly speaking, you can place the reverb directly on the channel. So here's my channel right here that I'm working with. You can hear that. Hear how dry that is. Right, that's the LA scoring strings. No room sound, no reverb. By the way, I apologize. I noticed that sometimes when I hit this too hard, it is shaking the camera. I'm gonna have to fix that in the next video. Hopefully you don't get like sick from that. So I'll try to hit it a little softer. So anyway, back to the topic. Here is my channel, right, with my cello sound. And you can put reverb directly on the channel itself, and this is very common. The thing I would caution against you from ever getting in the habit of doing that, except for in very unique situations, and the main reason is because you can imagine if you wanted to put reverb on every instrument individually in your entire orchestra, your computer would probably come to a screeching halt. There's just too much. You're putting way too much on your computer to maintain all those instances, particularly convolution reverb. So we're going to get into the kind of pros and cons of convolution reverb versus the next reverb, which we'll talk about. But I'll just tell you right now, the one big con of convolution reverb is it takes up a lot of memory, it takes up a lot of juice from your computer. And if you have them spread across every instrument, it's going to kill your session. So therefore, I choose to create an aux track. So here you can see this convolution auxiliary track, and that's obviously stands for convolution reverb. And on it, I have my quantum leap spaces. So it's sitting there, and now whenever I want to apply it to any instrument, I come over and I can turn it on through my aux send. So here, bus 1 is the convolution reverb. So I select that, and then I can adjust how much I'm sending to it. So watch, I'll turn it down, I'll start playing, still dry, and watch the meters on quantum leap spaces there as I turn it up. Wow, pretty cool, huh? So you can tell already I've placed it in a space now. So I'm gonna just mute it for a second, turn it off. So here's the original LA scoring strings, and there is no reverb at all, right? And now I'm gonna turn it on. And I've instantly placed that string sound in this San Francisco hall. One thing I'll call out is when you use reverbs in this way, where you're sending it to an aux track like this, generally we will turn the dry signal all the way down because we don't want to send a duplicate of what's already coming out of the channel. We just want pure reverb. And so we also crank up the wet signal. And when I did that, you can already tell I've kind of added way too much. So I'm going to pull that down. The idea behind this setup of a purely wet signal that's being sent to the reverb is that you just want pure reverb at this stage because it's an aux track. You don't need to blend it, or excuse me, the blending will happen because we already have the original clean sound coming from this channel here. And we're just kind of dipping in a little bit of reverb, and it's just great because you can control it, and you can do this across any track in your session, and by adjusting the send that you're sending to it. And this is basically telling the reverb how much of the original sound I want to send to the reverb effect. So again, and with it off. So certainly if you're after creating an epic sound and you want to create a big room, there you go, right? You got it. And we've done it by using convolution reverb in this case. So the convolution, once again, it is, you can think of it as a sample of the reverb. They're sampling the sound of the room. And when you add your instrument to it, you are essentially placing your instrument inside the room they sampled. It's crazy. It's so cool. Now, I promised you a minute ago I was going to talk about the pros and cons before we jump into the other type of reverb. The con, or the pros of convolution, is it's very realistic. It is literally a blueprint, a copy of a room somewhere, and you're placing your instrument in it. So it sounds fantastic. The downside, as I touched on briefly a second ago, is it uses up a lot of juice for your computer. A lot of your memory is eaten up by storing all these different samples of the room. So they can be very taxing on your computer, and you can't use a lot of them. The way around that, of course, is I just showed you, you would do a single instance on an aux track like we've done, and then you send your source, your string sound or your brass or whatever you're sending, individually, you send them one at a time to a single instance. So in this case, I'm able to send each instrument, and I can adjust how much I want to send. So I'm adjusting how much reverb I'm sending to it. You know, some instruments might have more, some might have less. That's in the next video. We talk about why. And we send it to a single instance of this reverb, and you don't have to blow up your computer. So that is how you get around that. So the second kind of reverb is called algorithmic reverb. And algorithmic reverb is you can think of it as like a synthetic computer generated reverb. So they didn't necessarily go and study a bunch of rooms and then, you know, record them and sample them and basically recreate a blueprint of a room. Instead, what they're doing is they're programming their own version of a reverb sound and providing it within a piece of software like this. And you might think, well, why would I want that? Well, first of all, it sounds freaking incredible. It has a very powerful and somewhat unique sound, which we're going to hear in a second. Also, just like I said a second ago, the convolution is going to eat up your computer and destroy, you know, your memory. Algorithmic reverbs, on the other hand, are much more friendly on your resources. So you can add more of them. They're not going to drain your memory as much. As well, they're a lot more customizable. You get a lot more control. And we're actually going to use this lexicon reverb to hear what it sounds like, and also to talk about some of the common controls that you'll see. Again, I have to put on my glasses. I can't read the screen. Some of the stuff's too small. So now we're listening to an algorithmic reverb. So I'm going to come over here. Once again, same technique. I'm going to turn off, for now, the convolution reverb we just listened to. And I'm going to turn on the algorithmic. This is going to use the lexicon. And once again, just so you can remember, I don't have the Albion 1 on. I have just the pure dry LA scoring strings, just so you can really hear. I mean, this is what makes it dramatic. So I'm going to turn this off for a second to remind you. Super dry, right? Now let's turn it on. Oops. So now let's turn on the lexicon. Algorithmic reverb. So this is synthetic reverb. So I mentioned a second ago, the real benefit of the algorithmic ones, in addition to being less processor heavy, is you get tons of control. Look at all this control here. The main ones I want to call your attention to, and some of these are repeated in the convolution reverbs as well, but I'm just using this interface to kind of illustrate. The common ones are the pre-delay, the reverb time, of course, how long it lasts, diffusion, and the other one I'll call your attention to is this. They call it early level here. It's often called early reflection. So we're going to talk about each one of those. But first, just listen to that sound. Now let's switch back to the convolution. To me, at least the spaces convolution reverb, it sounds just a little more realistic. It sounds a little more darker. The tail's not as long. At least, well, of course, it depends on how you configure it. And now let's listen to the algorithmic lexicon. Sounds a little brighter to me. So obviously, it's a preference. And we're going to talk a bit about kind of a way of using both in a minute. But before we do that, let's just really quickly talk about these settings, because this gets back to the very first thing we talked about, which is we're trying to place our instruments inside of a space. We're trying to create a room and give our listeners the idea that they're listening to something inside of a room, that it's actually placed somewhere. So the pre-delay is a common tool you'll see in a lot of digital reverbs. And the pre-delay, when a sound is hit, the pre-delay is the time between when that sound is first hit and when you hear the first bit of reverb. So we're going to start with pre-delay. So again, let's go back to our example of a instrument being played inside of a giant hall. So I'm sitting in a big symphony hall and I strike a string on my cello. But the time from when I first strike it to when we first hear something come back, like the first reflections, essentially the reverb comes back, that's the pre-delay. So the longer that time is, it gives us the impression that the room is bigger, because a longer pre-delay means that, you know, that wall or that closest surface is farther away. It creates, again, this gets a bit into our mixing conversation, which will be in the next video on this. But pre-delay is a great thing to use, not only to make the room feel bigger, but you can also just use it as a tool to create some space between your instrument and the reverb itself. If you can imagine, if you have a very short pre-delay and you have a giant symphony that you've recorded in your DAW, and every instrument is firing back reverb the second the sound is made, it starts to get very muddy. And often, pre-delay is actually just used to create a little bit of separation between when that sound is hit and when that reverb comes back. So it kind of has a nice utility there. But in terms of what it's telling our listener, the longer the pre-delay, the larger the room. And of course, the reverse is the case. Shorter pre-delay, smaller room. The next one I'm talking about, reverb time. This is probably the most obvious. That is the amount of seconds the reverb lasts. So when I hit it, you know, this is set to, 2 seconds? Hopefully I'm reading that right. That just means it lasts for about 2 seconds. And of course you can crank this up. And you can create all sorts of wild effects. I would urge you to check out a reverb called Black Hole by Eventide. Like, they have all these wild, amazingly sounding reverb effects, and they're basically playing around with all these tools to recreate really cool sound effects. It's less about being realistic, but more often, I should say, it's less about being realistic, but more about creating these big, lush, epic sounds. So that's the reverb time. The other one that we're going to talk about for now is diffusion. This one, I had a little bit of... By the way, obviously, reverb time also contributes to telling our listener the size of the room. And this is kind of self-explanatory, but the longer the reverb time, we would expect it to be a bigger room, right? And the shorter reverb time, smaller room. So diffusion is the next one I wanted to talk about just briefly. This one might be a little hard to understand, but if you hear the sound of the reverbs, again, what is the reverb? As I said at the beginning of this video, reverb is all those little reflections kind of coming together. They're bouncing around the room and they're coming together in this like wash of sound, that tail. Diffusion, this gets really very very detailed here. We're getting into the weeds dramatically, but if you imagine each of those little reflections as little spikes of reverb, little peaks of reverb. I'm trying to get my fingers in there in the camera. Oh, there we go. The more diffusion means that you're going to hear less of those individual little bursts of reverb. Kind of a weird concept, but if you're hearing something with a lot of diffusion, then you are probably in a large room because those little individual spikes of reverb are just starting to blur together. There's so much of it that it's just blurring together and it just sounds like a wash. Whereas if I turn it down, if I turn the diffusion down, the room gets smaller and you can almost, I mean, not literally, but you can almost start to hear the individual little peaks of reverb. Again, probably a little hard to hear, but the idea is more diffusion, larger room. Less diffusion, smaller room. So you're probably seeing a little bit of kind of a theme here, right? You have longer pre-delay. That means the room is bigger, right? It takes more time for the reflections and the reverb to come back. More diffusion, bigger room, because there's more of these the little spikes of reverb have more time to kind of blur together, and it just turns into more of a wash of sound at that point. So bigger room. The last one we're going to talk about is early reflections, and Lexicon kind of has their own kind of POV on this, but I will tell you the general concept behind early reflections. It's somewhat self-explanatory. That is the sound, the reflections that you hear first. So I think a better way to explain this again is think about the room you're in right now. Look around the room at all the surfaces you have. You have the desk. In my case, I have a desk. I have the computer screen. I have my keyboard here. I have walls very close by. So when I clap, the very, very first reflections to come back are the things that are the closest, and they are going to sound different than the reflections that come back from further away. So even though the reflections from a time perspective are going to be different, we know that, we've talked about that, but there's also the tonality. They're going to sound different. So if you have more early reflections, so if we crank this up, then the room is actually going to seem smaller, because think about it. You're in a small room, like I'm in a small room right now, and I clap. Those early reflections come back a lot quicker. They're going to have a different sound to them. It's going to sound like I'm in a smaller room, as opposed to being in a giant hall and clapping. The closest surfaces near me might be, feet and feet and feet away. So there might not even be any early reflections. So then we would turn our early reflections down, and that's going to give the sound of a bigger room. Again, I think different different reverb companies approach this topic a little bit different, and so I mostly just want to approach it from what it is, like what early reflections are. Sort of self-explanatory. They're the first reflections we hear, and so if you're hearing them very, very quickly, and there's more of them, that means it's a smaller room. So that's how we could create a smaller room. Now, one last quick thing I want to go over before we end this video, this part one of the reverb video, because we have a lot more to cover. At least one more part. I think there might be 2 more videos, but for now, probably 1 more video. But the last thing you might be asking about as well, all I've been playing around with is LA scoring strings. What about Albion 1? It's got its own reverb, right? It's baked into the sample, as we went over many times, including in the first video in this series. So what do I do with Albion 1? So let's go back and let's just solo Albion 1 again. Turn off the reverbs. I'll tell you what I generally do. And this is a technique that I think a lot of people do, is at least at first, when you're first approaching how to deal with reverb and an orchestral sample library environment, is step 1 is you want to place the sounds in a room, which we've been talking about the entire time in this video, right? So we want to first make sure our sounds, our samples, our orchestra, our percussion, the whole thing is inside of a room. So in the case of the LA scoring strings, we got none of that because it's 100% dry. So we used a convolution reverb, which is, of course, literally the sound of a room, and we placed LA scoring strings, dry samples, into a real room. So we got that covered. Once you do that, the next step often is to use a algorithmic reverb, especially if you have a lot of different sounds and you have a lot of different samples. Maybe they're from different libraries, different companies, and they're all kind of getting placed into a room. And again, in the next video in this series of reverb, we're going to talk about much more advanced things with reverb, like not just that they're in the room, but where physically they're in the room, right? So that's the concept of the room. Now we're going to talk about, or now we're going to use an algorithmic reverb, which tends to give you a lot more control, allows you to make a much longer tail, for example. And we're going to use that to give kind of a sheen and a glue on top of our orchestra sitting in a room. So 2 reverbs, this is a common technique. 1, the convolution, to place the sounds in the room, because again, literally, convolution reverb is the sound of a room. So we're going to place them all in there, and then we use the algorithmic reverb more as I kind of use it as a glue to kind of bring the whole thing together and to allow a nice tail of reverb to kind of wash over the whole sound at the end. So interesting techniques. Now, that's not the only way to do it. I'm sure there's a lot of different ways to do it, but that's a very common one, 2 reverb technique. Doesn't mean you have to go out and buy one of every, reverb ever made. It's just there's 2 different kinds, and a lot of the DAWs that you own, that you might own, probably have both for free anyway. So you don't need to go buy all these reverbs. A lot of them come with free convolution and free algorithmic reverbs. Very common. It's just good to know what they are, what the difference is, and why you'd want to use one or the other. So that brings me to the closing little discussion here, and that is what happens if you have a sample library that already has the reverb baked into it. It already has the room baked into it. And of course, we know that our lovely Spitfire libraries, in particular, I have Albion 1 open right now, they've got tons of room sound. So they're already inside of a room. So we don't need to add more room necessarily. So in this scenario, what I often do is if I'm working with all Spitfire libraries, I'll often just keep the room sound at a decent level. So I might keep it somewhere in the middle here for all the instruments. And again, we adjust this based on the instrument because different instruments are sitting in different places in the room. That's in the next video. But generally speaking, I will include the room sound because I want that natural, that's real. That's an actual sample. There is no 2 ways about that. No one's going to argue with that. That is a real string sound in a real room. So that's the real deal. So I'll often keep that there. It might balance it up or down again. depending on if I want something to be up close or pushed towards the back. And then, kind of if we go back to the technique I just described, once I've placed it in a room, so in the case of Spitfire libraries, for example, they are already in a room. So then I use the algorithmic reverb kind of as the sheen and the glue on top of everything. So if I've got percussion and brass, and maybe I've got some synths or other instruments going on, maybe they're all in their own different rooms, but that one algorithmic reverb sits on top of all of them and allows it to kind of glue together. That's one technique. Another one, very common, and in fact, I think this is probably done more, is a lot of people will go into their wet libraries, and if they're blending a lot of different libraries and you got a lot of different room sounds, they'll just try to get that as dry as possible. So you'll go in to each of your wet libraries and you'll get them, you'll turn on the close mics and you'll try to get it so there's a small amount of reverb, small amount of room sound as possible. In the case of All Being One, this is all I get. That's as dry as it gets. Still pretty good. I've turned it all off. Now I'm back to using these two together, and it gives me more control because now I can go into spaces and I can essentially move All Being One from Air Studios to the San Francisco hall that I have here. Instantly moved locations. It went from Air in London to this hall in San Francisco, just like that. And now I'm back to doing that with a combination of the algorithmic as the glue and the tail on top. One technique. Obviously, a lot of different ways to do this, but hopefully you understand that just as a concept, right? You got two different types of reverbs. Convolution, which is more realistic. It's an actual sound of a room, and we want to use that when we want to place an instrument into a room. Then you got algorithmic, which is the synthetic reverb, that's just computer generated, but gives you a lot more control and also allows you to create longer, more lush reverbs, longer tails. And it's a great tool for adding a bit of sheen and glue on top to bring all the instruments together. Anyway, I'm running out of, I'm losing my voice. I've been talking too much. This video is too long. So please like and subscribe. I hope you come back and watch part 2 of this video and all the other videos I have in this series. They're very helpful, particularly if you're just starting out, but I'm sure you'll learn something no matter what your level is. So like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.